Galatians chapter 1, beginning in verse 6. And we started part of this last week, so the first half of this particular paragraph we've already talked about, but just to get a running start at it. I marvel that you are turning away so soon from him who called you in the grace of Christ to a different gospel, which is not another. But there are some who trouble you and want to pervert the gospel of Christ. But even if we or an angel from heaven preach any other gospel to you than what we have preached to you, let him be accursed. As we have said before, so now I say again, if anyone preaches any other gospel to you than what you have received, let him be accursed. And so we talked about the fact that when he says he marveled, it's the word he's astonished. He just can't believe it. It's when you get news that you just can't wrap your mind around and can't understand that how could that happen. That's what he's saying there. It's not just, wow, this is interesting. It was more of, I just can't believe this. The way Kevin would probably say it very incorrectly is, what's wrong with you people? They're just, I can't believe that you're actually doing this. You've been called in grace, and yet you're following after another so-called gospel because he says it's not a gospel. It's not good news, because anything that takes you away from the gospel of grace, the gospel of good news, that can't be good news, because we're only saved by that grace. And we stand in that grace by our faith, Paul says in the book of Romans. And so he mentions that, but he also mentions there, giving us an insight into why he's writing this letter there in the last part of verse 7. There are some who trouble you who want to pervert the gospel of Christ. And we talked about that word pervert means to twist, to turn, to change. And so what they're doing is they're taking the gospel of Christ and just undoing it, tearing it apart, and sewing it back together again in ways that it was never intended to be. And so we said in our introductory comments about this, one of the reasons that Paul is writing to the churches of Galatia was because there was something going on, we think, with the Judaizing teachers who were insisting that if you're going to be a Christian and if you're going to go to heaven, you have to follow that Old Testament law as well. And Paul's going to deal with that argument throughout the book and say, no, that's not the way it works. That law was supplanted. It was nailed to the cross. It was done away with because it was, well, shall we say, inferior in the sense that it can't save. It could take care of sins for a year, and then what happened the next year? Sacrifice all over again, and had to do it all over again. And so Jesus came, that perfect once-for-all sacrifice. And yet you're wanting to go back to that old system where you have to go to the temple every year. And, oh, by the way, Paul doesn't say this, but in a few years, that temple's not going to be there anymore. Then what are you going to do? And so that's kind of the issue where the church at Galatia was, and they were having this difficulty. We mentioned that when Augustus made Galatia territory of Rome, a province of Rome, that he resettled some 2,000 Jewish families in that area. And so that was in about 25 BC, so by the time Paul is writing this, a lot of time has passed for those Jewish families to grow, and so there's a large Jewish population, which we assume is where this is coming from, those people who are still hanging on to that particular ideology. But here's the point we start with this morning, verse 8. But even if we or an angel from heaven preach any other gospel to you than what we have preached to you, let him be accursed. As we said before, so say now I again, if anyone preaches any other gospel to you than what you have received, let him be accursed. Now, angel, poof, appears right here beside me this morning. And we know it's an angel. We can tell it's an angel. I mean, we're just play acting here. But if that were to happen, and he were to take this microphone, or I guess angels aren't given in marriage, so we can't say he or she. That gets into the whole gender stuff. But and he says, the gospel is not by grace, but it's an angel. What would be your natural reaction? Okay, yeah, we got it wrong. Sorry about that. And I think that's what Paul is doing. He's saying this for the sake of the shock value. If an angel comes down from heaven and preaches to you any other thing than what we've preached, let him or it or whatever be accursed. Why is that? Dave?
Well, I think Paul using an extreme example.
Sure.
he was facing those who said, look at my credentials. Mm-hmm. Ignore Paul's credentials, look at my credentials.
Right.
And Paul is saying it doesn't matter what your credentials are. You know, and even today we have people who say, look at my credentials and you follow me. You know, and so an angel's not going to appear and tell us anything like that. But
yeah, shall we say he's using hyperbole here, just to say, you know, this is the extreme case. But the preaching of the gospel, which he had already said, I'm an apostle, not by man, but by God. I received this gospel, not by man, but by God. And that's what I'm preaching to you, and that's what you believe. Therefore, don't change it. Don't believe anything other than what you've had, no matter what the credentials, even if it's an angel standing there trying to tell you something different. Elwin, you're next, and then Flo.
Yes, it's very interesting if you look at Mormonism. Most of the people that started the early Mormon church were Methodists, Baptists, Lutherans, and whatnot. And then the angel Moroni came and talked to Joseph Smith. Mm-hmm. And then we have the Book of Mormon. So that's a perfect example of an angel coming to you and doing this thing. Mm-hmm. And we always told them, well, bring us these golden vessels and everything that you have to prove this. Well, we don't know where they are. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, there's no way to prove it. But still, here is a corruption of the gospel from hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of people.
Absolutely. Flo?
Don't forget that Satan was an angel.
Yeah. Okay. You got these spiritual beings, and not all of them are good, are they? There's spiritual warfare going on in that realm that we can't begin to understand or even talk intelligently about because we don't have enough information. So we know that there's stuff going on in that world. I think Paul's initial problem here is not with any of that. That's the source of the problem. But his problem is he's addressing those people inside the church who are trying to change the gospel to something that it's not. Janelle?
Well, we know that the gospel was once delivered,
and
it came through the apostles because Jesus had given it to them for their spreading of it. And, you know, if we listen to every angel that came along, we certainly would have not the original gospel that God planned for us to have. So, angels are messengers, but the apostles were the ones who delivered the gospel.
Yep. Go ahead, Dave.
Well, you know, occasionally you encounter preachers, leadership in the church that leans back on their credentials. I studied at Lipscomb, or I studied at Tennessee School of Preaching, or I studied at Bear Valley. You know, it's where you studied is important, but you can also have studied at some place that has not dedicated itself to making you a faithful gospel preacher as well. You know, so and even those who have studied other places, they can get swelled and think that they're above being questioned by anyone like us sitting back here. But we need to understand that it's our duty, it's our responsibility to stand up to people like that as well.
Yeah. I have a master's degree from Oklahoma Christian. Therefore, you ought to believe everything I say. And you laugh just instantly at that. There's the gospel, and there's those who preach the gospel. And aren't we told, isn't there a verse that says something like, test the spirits? And that's what we need to be about. That's why you're in class this morning, to learn, so that when you hear something preached, you have the ability to discern whether it's right or wrong. Because if you don't have that ability, if you haven't studied it, if the authority all rests within the person at the podium, then what's going to be the end result? You're going to believe exactly the way he believes. And whether what he believes is right or not, you don't know. And so that's why we open our Bibles and we study, and we do that together so that we know what we're doing. Because it hadn't never happened to me, but once in a while preachers make mistakes. You know, every once in a while. And it may be intentionally or maybe out of ignorance or read something different. But we've all got to be on our guard to protect the beauty of the gospel of Jesus Christ. John and then Ellen.
notice too, he puts himself in that same category, even if we
Yeah.
were an angel from heaven. So, as Janelle said, the apostles brought the gospel to us, and we're not going to change it either. What you have is the final chapter, if you will, of the gospel.
Yeah, so Paul even says, if I preach to you something different that you've already received, don't listen to me. Don't believe me, because something's wrong with that. Ellen?
Yeah, another thing we have to watch for too is tares in the church.
Mm-hmm.
I know that probably many of you have been in different congregations where people are members. But once you talk to them and start becoming friendly with them, you start to find out what their true beliefs are.
Mm-hmm.
And since they work directly with Satan, that's their job. They're to come in and throw around all these things and say yes, like Satan did to Eve. You know, hey, you can do this, don't worry about that. God won't say anything about it, because you can be forgiven if you go and confess and repent.
Yeah, absolutely. So, again, we understand the purity and the nobility and the perfectness of the gospel, and we should never mess with that, never monkey with that, simply because doing so could actually cause people to lose their souls by believing that which is incorrect. And so we guard that, and we value that, and we study it over and over again to make sure that we've got it right. Dave?
This is also a message for those who believe that once you've been saved, you're always saved.
Mm-hmm.
You know, being accursed, I think the NIV says, let him be eternally condemned.
Okay.
So as you said, I think we all know of cases where formerly good, strong preachers, teachers, and so forth, for some reason or another, went off in the other direction.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so Paul is saying, you do that, you're not saved. You know, it's not a question of if you were saved; it's a question you were once saved and you know more.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so.
Yeah, and let's go on to that word accursed. It's the word anathema. And so, bind under a great curse, devoted to the direst of woes. One lexicon identifies that word as, and there are others that use different wording, but it all basically says the same thing. 3 examples of where it's used in other places in the New Testament. Acts 23:14. And they, the conspirators who wanted to kill Paul, came to the chief priests and elders and said, we have bound ourselves under a great curse, that we will eat nothing until we have slain Paul. Well, I wonder how long that lasted. Just curious. Because they never could slay Paul. And I wonder if they finally went back to eating. Immaterial. For I could wish that myself were accursed for Christ, for my brethren, my kinsmen, according to the flesh, Romans 9 and verse 3. That's Paul. And he is so troubled by the fact that his people, his Hebrew people, his Jewish people, aren't accepting the gospel, that he's indicating here, or basically saying, if I could become a curse, I would willingly do that if it ensured that all my brethren were saved. And that's a pretty powerful statement, isn't it? Because how many of us would be willing to do that? I don't know. But Paul said that, and that shows you the depth of his feeling about his own people. Even though he was the apostle to the Gentiles, he still loved his own people. That's why when he went into every city, the first thing he did was go into the synagogue and preach and teach in there. Again, that curse is the same word there. 1 Corinthians 16:22, if any man love not the Lord Jesus Christ, let him be accursed. And again, Dave points out New International says eternally condemned or something of that nature. Maybe some of your versions say something different. Of course, the text we use is New King James Version. But this is a big deal. We're not just talking about something that's, kind of so-so, depends on your opinion, depends on what you think. No, this is something that has eternal consequences of not obeying and listening to what the gospel teaches us about Jesus. And the power in that is, if Jesus was willing to sacrifice his life and become sin for all, then why would we even think we should change anything after he paid such a great price? What's that?
Human arrogance.
Human arrogance, absolutely. That's what it boils down to. And many times that's that's the issue with leaders in the church. They get puffed up because they are the leader in the church. And then they become arrogant. And that arrogance then leads to, well, I can just do what I want to. Dave and then John.
Well, I think Paul told Timothy that teachers come under a stricter judgment.
Mm-hmm.
That, if you're going to teach, make sure that you know what you're talking about.
Sure. Absolutely. Absolutely. John?
A lot of people these days, I've heard this for a number of years, the gospel is a living document. Things aren't the same these days as they were back then. It's got to change with the time.
Yeah, and that kind of makes perfect sense in some ways, doesn't it? I mean, it sounds good, but Paul said, if you preach anything other than what you've been preached, you're going to be accursed. So that pretty well ties it up, shuts the door, locks it away forever. Don't change the gospel. I saw another hand. Yes.
Yeah, as a member of that synagogue, I would have a hard time with that.
Sure.
Because my whole life I've been told this way.
Yep.
And I'm wondering how that played out.
Yeah, and good point here. You've got a bunch of people who came specifically out of the Jewish heritage, and they've been taught that their entire life. Their entire life. And their parents, and their parents' parents, and however far back their family goes. They've been taught that same thing, and all of a sudden now they're faced with this new, completely new idea. And they had a hard time with that. Is that understandable? Well, sure. I think I've asked this before. If you're willing to, how many of you came to the church out of some other religious group or no religious group? Yeah, several in this room came out of that. How hard was that? It was hard, especially in some places where if you do that, your family shuns you for that. I've used this illustration before, but there was a gentleman that Art Clark started studying with. And Grady and I both had sessions with him and talking with him. Smart guy, intelligent man. And he was coming out of the Catholic faith. And he studied and he studied and he studied and he got right down to the end. Okay, this is the point of you either accept this or not. And his response was, I believe everything I've been taught, but I just can't leave my family behind. And that's the last we saw of him. And again, you say, well, what's wrong with him? Well, got to understand the pressure he was under. And sometimes this is not an easy thing to come to Jesus and follow him the way you're supposed to, especially if it's completely opposed to what you've been taught all your life. And that's hard. And you got to appreciate people who are willing and able to do that. And yes, we understand that if they don't make that choice, that's a bad thing. But at least try to be understanding of why they made that choice and the pressure they were under in that. Doesn't make anything better, but at least have that sympathy, if you will, in that response. All right, Don.
Well, a lot of times you have to remember that their faith in their disbelief or unbelief is just as strong as our faith.
Yeah,
okay.
Absolutely,
or maybe even stronger.
And that's something we need to understand. Somebody who is in a completely different religious group, completely different church, whatever. I think we sometimes, in our own mind, think just the opposite of what Don said. Well, they're not really that faithful. They're not really that strong. If they were that strong, they'd be doing better. These people are faithful, and they are sincere, and they're committed to whatever it is that they're involved in and whatever church they're involved in. And we need to understand that and not belittle that in any way because it's their faith. They're on fire for it sometimes. And so as we think about that, it's a powerful thing. And so when we go out to preach and teach, we have to keep that in mind. Our job, plant the seed. And for this gentleman I mentioned that Grady and Art and I all talked to, I'm hoping someday that seed will sprout. Somebody else will have the opportunity to baptize him maybe. I don't know. But I'm hoping that's what will happen. I pray that's what happens. But the seed was planted, and he admitted he knew what to do. He just couldn't do that. Steve?
We got to remember, too, during the time of the writing him talking to the churches of Galatia, there was still the thought that Jesus was not resurrected. And if this is a reference to the gospel. This is one of the key tenets of the gospel. And so we know even the Sadducees didn't believe, in the resurrection. So there are people out there who, if they don't believe in the resurrection, it nullifies the gospel.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. People who didn't believe in the resurrection. Your Bible reading this week, if you're keeping along with the one the church goes in Thessalonians, talked about those who said, oh, well, he's already come back. And there are people who believe that. And so there's all sorts of beliefs out there. And we have to understand that the only way to fix all of that is to stick with what we've got. And that's God's Word. And use that as our standard and our measuring point for what we're doing. And sometimes that's hard. Sometimes it's difficult to get there. But salvation of our souls is worth all that effort, isn't it? All right. Other thoughts, comments? Janelle.
A thought about angels. And he said, don't even listen to an angel if they come. If we think about any of the times or all of the times that we can think of, that angels have been God's messenger to individuals, to groups and whatever. But think about the angel that delivered the message to Mary and Joseph that they would have a son who would be the Savior. And as she pointed out a moment ago, you've been brought up that way. You've thought about this. And to have something that is so contradictory to what you've been brought up with, that's a very hard thing. So even angels, God's not going to send messages by angels in that fashion at that point anymore.
Sure,
so,
absolutely.
And if this man who couldn't accept, if he could accept this, he probably could convert the rest of his family, or might be able to. It's hard.
Yep.
And if he thought about it in that way, in my case, it was really hard and it didn't work. But the possibility is still there.
Sure. And we never give up praying for them and hoping that they'll see that. And again, we plant the seed. Nobody, I don't think Grady, Art, or I are going to be called on the carpet on the day of judgment because this gentleman didn't accept the gospel. Because we planted the seed. We preached the word. And that's all you can do. Because if they don't respond because they have embraced it and believe it wholeheartedly, then again, there's a whole problem with that as well. And so, again, difficult circumstances, and Paul is dealing with that. Paul dealt with that in pretty much every epistle that he wrote, and dealing with things that were contrary to the gospel. And then he starts in verse 10, and I don't think it's accidental that he went on to say what he says here. He said, "For do I now persuade men or God? Or do I seek to please men? For if I still please men, I would not be a bondservant of Christ. But I make known to you, brethren, that the gospel which was preached to me by me is not according to man. For I neither received it from man, nor was I taught it, but it came through the revelation of Jesus Christ." That's the second time he's made the point in these first few verses of the book of Galatians. Didn't come from man. Peter didn't preach me this. John didn't teach me this. Nobody taught me this but Jesus himself. And so that's, I think, a powerful statement for that. But the interesting thing is, let's look at that word persuade real quick. It's the word pitho. And it means to make friends of, to win one's favor, to gain one's goodwill, to seek to win one, to strive to please one. And so Paul is saying, after he said all this about the gospel and anybody being accursed, he's saying, who am I out to please? Men or God? If I'm going to please men, how am I going to preach? Yeah. What do you believe, Mike? Well, I don't believe baptism is necessary for the forgiveness of sin. God bless you. That's good for you. You believe Jesus rose from the dead, Janet? And she says, no, I don't believe that. God bless you. That's good. And it's the idea of just whatever people believe, that you're good with that. And you're fine with that. That's persuading men. Now, imagine yourself standing before God. God, I know you said baptism for the remission of sins, but you didn't really mean that, did you? Nobody would ask that question ever, I don't think. Or, Jesus didn't really rise from the dead. You wouldn't say that to God. And so it's a matter of who is my audience. And my audience literally is not you guys. And I'm not your audience. Our audience is God. And He's the one we're doing this for. Flo?
Well, we don't want to condone false teaching. We shouldn't. And anything against the truth of the gospel. But on the other hand, it's not our place to condemn.
Sure. Yeah. Whose job is it to condemn? God's. Yeah. And we'll leave that up to Him. And thank goodness it's not my job. I don't want that kind of responsibility. I have enough trouble keeping myself straightened out, much less straightening out the whole world. And so we understand that, but we've got to stick to preaching the gospel, persuading God, or to win one's favor in a sense, in that process of winning God's favor. You're preaching my word. I'm thankful for that. Dave?
But didn't Paul just now condemn people?
Okay.
Did he just tell them that you're good, you're cursed?
You're a curse? Okay. Mike?
We don't condemn, we don't curse or anything, but we do have a responsibility to show someone, if we know that they're not under God's grace and rather under His condemnation, to point out to them that they are accursed. Not that I'm accursing them, not that I'm condemning them, not that I'm judging them, but I, out of love, want to help them be able to see there's some changes that needs to be taking place. You are under the curse, and you're not seeing it. I can see it because I know what the Bible, says, because Kevin taught me the Bible.
Yeah, there you go.
And anyhow, so we do have a responsibility to point out to people that we have the opportunity to point it out to, that they are under the curse.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And think of it this way. When I preach to you the gospel, or anybody preaches to you the gospel, not just me, and you preach it for what it says, for what it is, and they are at odds with that and find themselves, whether they admit it or not, in that state of being condemned, am I the one who's condemned them? The gospel is condemned, hasn't it? That's the purpose, and I think that goes back to Dave's comment. Yes, if we took that to mean, well, we can't, if we say anything bad about that person's faith or contradictory to that person's faith, then we're condemning them. No, that's not what it means. Because Paul, he pointed the finger at him and said this. Jesus pointed the finger at people and said this because they were to be brought to bear on that. And so when I preach the gospel, it's not so, you're not going to believe that gospel? Well, I preached it to you. You're in trouble now. That shouldn't be my attitude. My attitude should be a sense of loss and sadness that they don't accept that, and the prayer that they will eventually, as the seed grows, that will happen. But God's going to be the one who's going to do that. Marcia and then John.
Well, you pretty much said what I was going to say.
Okay.
We have to remember that it's God's word. It's not us.
Right.
That's condemning. We just present what God has said, and then from there, it's up to Him. We're not to judge.
Right. Yeah, God, vengeance is mine, thus saith the Lord. He'll take care of that. Thankfully, He'll take care of that, and we don't have to worry about that. But we do have to worry about preaching the gospel in its truth and its entirety. John?
When studying with someone, you take them through the Bible. They believe in the veracity and the truth of the Bible. But there's a point in a study where they have to feel lost. And until they feel lost, they don't really, or shouldn't really, be baptized, because the purpose of baptism is to address that issue. And we've had situations where we get up to that point, and then folks will say, well, I don't really feel lost. And then you have to either go back. But it goes back to the condemning of Mike and Marcia's point that with every individual, you have to say, I'm in trouble. I need to do something about this. And oftentimes in study, that's kind of a tough
Sure.
hump to get over.
Yeah.
Toward the end of the story.
That's we had a teacher in school who he said, this is not a very good example, but he said that's closing the deal. That's where you close the deal, when they finally admit to that. Day of Pentecost. This Jesus, whom you crucified, God has made both Lord and Christ. And what was their response? They were pricked in the heart. Men and brethren, what shall we do? And so there was that acknowledgement of that as well. Diana and then Flo.
This reminds me of a conversation I had with my sister, and it's based on 2 Peter 2 and 21 and 22. It would be better for them to have known the way of righteousness than to have known it and then turn back, and in this case, revert back to where they were. Mm-hmm. So her thoughts were, we're supposed to preach or talk about the gospel of Christ, but she felt that she would save someone if she didn't share. And I said, but then you're missing the commandment at the same time. So sometimes we might feel a little leery because we put a person in a situation, such as when we say Art Harper teaching, that person now has received the information, and it's now up to them to make the decision. So it's not like he put him in that situation, it's the Word of God.
Sure, absolutely. And again, your passage you talked about, it would have been better for them not to have known than to go back. That's in essence what Paul's saying here. Isn't it? Don't go back, because it'd be better off for you to never heard than that, because then you realize what you lost, what you had, and what you've lost. All right, who's next? Flo.
Well, I think Mike's 100% right. It's all about teaching.
Mm-hmm.
That's what Paul's trying to do, is teach them so they can teach others. But where I fail teaching others is sometimes when I come across with an arrogance, what I call Christian arrogance and self-righteousness. Mm-hmm. That's where I've lost people to listen to the gospel.
Yeah.
I fail that way.
And the amazing thing about every person who shares and preaches the gospel of Jesus Christ, at one point in time, you were in their same shoes. You were lost too. And if we don't remember that, then it's like, well, I've always been saved. And that just doesn't come across very well at all, does it? Elwin, you had a comment.
Yes, the other thing that's very important is our own attitudes and how we approach the person and what we have to talk about. We have to pray about it. We have to think about it before we even start to have a conversation with someone that we know that's in trouble. They're not aware of it, and they don't believe they are. But you're going to have to give yourself a lot of time to work with a person. It may take months, it may take years, but you can't give up on someone because they're wrong, because eventually you pray, if you help them, you work with them, they trust you, you trust them, you have a lot better chance than just coming out that says, it says here to rebuke you for this reason. You need to change. Talk to you later. It doesn't work like that.
Yeah. Again, I planted, Apollos watered. What's the rest of that? God gave the increase. And we have to believe that. We have to believe that that's going to happen. Dave?
Paul was dealing with misinformation here. He's got false teachers who according to their credentials, former Jews. This is all about Judaistic teachers. And in some ways, I think today we have even a tougher job because of misinformation, because Paul was dealing with one issue. Now, everybody we meet has a mindset about Christianity, and they're misinformed, And, I mean, misinformation is something we hear a lot about today, but everybody we come across are misinformed. I have a lady that I've become friends with at one of the stores I go to, and she refers to God as a man upstairs, and I haven't had an opportunity to study with her yet. She's holding me an arm's length, but she's misinformed because God is not the man upstairs. He's much more than that, But that's the myth. And so every time we encounter someone, we've got to overcome that misinformation that is embedded in them, you know, and it's just so difficult to do. You know? And as others have said,
sure.
You can't just give up. You have to keep working.
And don't you hate to be wrong? How many of you like being wrong? None of us like that. And in a sense, you know, when you come to the gospel, there are things that mindsets and ideas you have that are wrong. And you have to admit that. And that's hard to do. And that's a difficult thing for people to come to grips with. But through the gospel, hopefully they can come to that position. And, you know, I say Paul was converted kicking and screaming, wasn't he? And it took a big deal to change his mind. And I think there are a lot of people that are that way as well. Paul calls himself, said, I would not be a bondservant of Christ. And I'd like for us to take just a little bit of time, and since the first bell has already rung, we won't start this morning. Let's talk about this idea of a bondservant. And we'll branch out beyond the book of Galatians and talk about what it means to be a bondservant, because I think that's a significant mindset that we have to have when we follow Christ, is that idea of a bondservant and what that means and what my attitude should be based on the fact that I'm a bondservant. So if it's all right, we'll go ahead and quit class right now unless there's any other comments that you want to make. Anything else? Dave?
I just might mention, just for thought, that Jesus said you can't have two masters.
Right.
You can either be a slave of one or the other.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Thanks for being here this morning.